Welcome, and today we're in conversation with Jeremy Nieboer, a Bruce Group contributor and author of A Lesson in Democracy. A barrister by profession, he specializes in corporate and commercial law and was the lead solicitor on the application to the High Court and Court of Appeal of then Foreign Secretary Douglas Hurd's decision to ratify the Maastricht Treaty. We'll be discussing his latest book, Climate, All Is Well, All Will Be Well, and some of the findings it makes, as well as the wider issues in society and in the world that may come as a consequence of the potentially radical outcomes of COP26 in Glasgow in November. We'll also be discussing the IPCC and its latest report, more specifically the summary for policymakers, as these reports are and were seen as the main source of information when they were released in September. If you would, they were the main bar to which world governments sought to meet when they come, or will seek to meet when they come to Glasgow. Jeremy, thank you very much for speaking to us.
Well, thank you for letting me have this interview. Yes, I look forward to it.
Thank you. I think that we can start here by discussing global warming and the arguments you put forward in your book. I'd like to note that we're not here to contradict any scientific consensus, but instead to reanalyze the information that is publicly available. We are, yes, quite. We are following the science. Science understood to be a spirit of endless questioning, experimentation, and testing of predictions and explanation. Some may disagree, but disagreeing is what science is about, and it's the culture of continuous scrutiny which brings forth advancements in humanity. So in your book, what is your take on global warming and the science behind it?
Well, fundamentally, I do not see this as a sustainable case for saying that the Earth's temperature has increased by reason of the density and increasing density of CO2 in the atmosphere. That is quite independent of the issue of the extent to which human beings are emitting CO2. I do not see, on the laws of physics, how it can be sustained that the Earth's temperature is increasing by reason of increasing density of CO2 in the atmosphere. That fundamentally is the issue. And there is one main scientific reason for asserting that, although there are subsidiary ones which we can touch on. Would you like me to ventilate that a bit further?
Yes, please, absolutely.
But I think first of all, we have to look at CO2 itself and see what is the nature of the gas and what is the extent or volume of the gas. It is, after all, the bearer of life. It's not a pollutant. It is the instrument by which nature works her miracle of photosynthesis. You have CO2 and water and sunlight, and you get sugar and starch in plants and oxygen. And indeed, it is CO2 which in this way maintains oxygen. So in that sense, it's a giver of life. But bear in mind, if you get down to 150 parts per million, and we're now 417 parts per million, life ceases because photosynthesis can't occur. So, and if you double CO2, then at around about 25 degrees C, you get a 50% increase in plant yields. So it's a very desirable gas. It is not a pollutant. It's not one of those gases that's bursting out of the chimneys we see. You know the ones with the great, awful, poisonous gases coming out of vast chimneys. It's not that at all.
It kind of takes apart the dichotomy, the supposed dichotomy between the dirty chimneys and deforestation, and a lot of those arguments surrounding it. Moreover, the sort of terminology behind carbon neutral.
Exactly.
Exactly. So in terms of sort of rising temperature, and what relationship do you think CO2 has with rising temperatures and global warming? Yes,
that's a good question. Naturally, it has something to do with it, because ultimately it's CO2 in the atmosphere without all the other greenhouse gases that maintain a solar radial temperature balance. Without that, the Earth would be very nearly a snowball. It really would, because all the heat would go straight to space. But you have to understand the cycle of heat. All heat comes from the sun. But only 70% of that reaches the lower atmosphere, the troposphere, and the surface. And that heat is reflected back and is lost to space from the atmosphere to the extent of 23%, to the extent of 25% by evaporation, 5% by convection, and 12%, very importantly, by surface radiation from the Earth, infrared radiation of the long wave. Now, 5%, that's the remaining amount of the sun's radiant heat that reaches the Earth, doesn't get back to space. It is detained by greenhouse gases, infrared radiation. Now, what happens to it when it reaches these greenhouse gases? Bear in mind that they're very close to the surface, these. CO2 is relatively very close to the surface, clouds less so. Now, it's the clouds that absorb most of this radiation, 95% of it. CO2 only absorbs about 4%. It's exactly 3.97, let's say 4%. So CO2 should absorb only 0.2% of the sun's rays and heat, because that is 4% of 5%. So you get to that 0.2, but it doesn't. What happens is that it gets saturated at a certain level of density. That means it cannot absorb any more infrared radiation from the Earth. And that level is between 250 and 280, and was reached in the pre-industrial era and around about 1880, 1890, and has not absorbed significant infrared radiation from the Earth since that time. And the reason is that CO2 can only absorb infrared radiation through certain microwaves. 12 to 16 are the microwaves through which this infrared radiation gets to be absorbed. Water vapor absorbs almost all of it, but there's just a window of 13 to 16 microns through which a CO2 can absorb radiation. But once it reaches saturation, that is not able to absorb further material amounts of radiation, then further additions of CO2 to the atmosphere make negligible difference. It's as if I put it like this, it's as if you had a pair of sunglasses and you wish to diminish the amount of sunlight coming in, but you can't do it with that pair of sunglasses. You put another pair on, and then another. But the more you put on, the less effective it is. So you have a logarithmic decline in effectiveness. And you can see this from the diagrams in the booklet. Well, don't ask you to look now, but figures 4 to 6 show this really quite clearly. And that is the explanation of why there is no runaway warming, and why when CO2 was 8 to 10 times its present level in the geological past, we never had runaway warming. Indeed, the ice ages were entirely unaffected by it, even when 8 to 10 times this level. So that's the central issue.
Absolutely, and so just to note for viewers, we'll be putting the link to some of the figures and some of the graphs below, and very soon you'll be able to purchase the book and see the graphs for yourselves. Absolutely. So I guess what you said sort of takes apart the general concept that human activity from the industrial age forward has created this drastically exponentially higher exponentially higher temperatures as a result of CO2 and et cetera, et cetera. So in terms of sort of temperatures, what do you think the issue is behind it?
Well, we have to look at what the temperature has been. When this racket started, and it is a racket, I hope you'll see that by the time I finish. In 1983, evidence was given by a chap called James Hansen to the Congress, US Congress. He was head of an organization called Goddard Institute for Space Science, GISS. He was a devoted dogmatist for global warming. And he was preaching the gospel right from 1983. He said that in the next 14 years, that's in 1983, temperature will go up by between 2 and 4 degrees in 14 years. Now that's a colossal increase. Now that simply has not happened. The IPCC, which is the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, which publishes reports regularly, main ones are 1990, 2001, 2007, and 2015, another latest one, which you've mentioned in your introduction. The IPCC, they have to show dangerous warming, that CO2 and temperature rise together. They have to rise together. Not only that, but CO2 has to precede temperature rise, because obviously you can't have a cause following an effect. So what the IPCC have done is, in effect, to achieve the result they want to show to the world, they have altered the graphs, which they published in 1999, to show that not an erratic variation of temperature, which there has been in the 20th century, but a continuous average increase. And if you look at figures 7 and 8, it's worth making a note, 7 and 8 of my booklet, you'll see that in the 1999 diagram showing US temperature in the 20th century was in 2007 simply altered. There was no scientific justification for that. And the purpose of it was to show an average increase in the 20th century in line with the known increase of CO2, which was constant right from 1850 really to 2021. That was the purpose of it. And they didn't just do that with the US temperature, they did it with the Arctic temperatures, the Reykjavik ice cores. And you can see that in figure 27. It's a terrible thing to have done. You see, what you've got to bear in mind, these are public documents. And they're public documents which support a theory of global warming, which has been preached in such a way as to cause serious worry, and more than worry, fear in thousands, if not millions of people. And the fact that this was done is, to my mind, utterly disgraceful. So you've got to bear in mind that we're dealing with something which is not really science. It's a kind of political, movement to justify a fundamental rebasing of Western economies and overthrowing of their energy base. So you can see from as a layman, I'm not an expert, but you don't need to be an expert. Having been a lawyer for nearly 50 years, you get a very good nose for the need for evidence and the way in which people make statements quite unsupported by evidence. And you also get a very good nose for fallacious and fraudulent statements. And I think I qualify, therefore, in looking at the IPCC's dogma. And I'll say one more thing. I don't think there are such things as experts who have some kind of divine knowledge beyond question. I think an expert is someone who gives himself a persona by reading other people's works. And I've read other people's works very thoroughly, you can see it in the booklet. I don't claim to be an expert.
Yes, I guess it sort of, it brings into question much more contemporary conceptions of science, whether in the context of COVID and now with climate change, that saying that following the science, something that I mentioned earlier, has become so encapsulated by blindingly, with full trust and with full thrust, following those who hold titles, who hold particular, who hold particular ranks.
Yes, it's become a belief entirely. It's all it is. It's a belief. And of course, the IPCC are not there. They're not formed. They weren't founded to look into whether there is climate change. And if there is climate change, what are the causes, natural and otherwise? They don't attempt to do that. That's not what they're doing. What they're doing is justifying a fundamental change in the way the Western economies exist, manage, and reuse their energy. And that has to be grasped, because the science, such as it is very accessible, it's lucid, and you can get to it through the internet. It's easy. Every single human being who's got a computer can read the science for themselves. And therefore, there's no excuse for pleading ignorance and saying the experts know. They do not. You do. You can find it, and you can see it. Within 30 seconds, you can get the planetary record of temperature for the last 43 years on the Alabama University, Dr. Roy Spencer's website.
Absolutely, and I think you include some graphs from Dr. Spencer in your book.
Yes, I think it's, from memory, I think it's 11 and 12. They're terribly good. The satellite, you see, you can't tamper with satellite data. I just mentioned the satellites, if I may. Up till 1979, it was possible to tamper with graphs, as I've explained. What the IPCC and a chap called Michael Mann both did disgracefully with the famous hockey stick graph, which was the main thrust of the 2001 IPCC report. And that was fraudulent. And he brought a case against Dr. Ball, who said that he ought to be in Penn State Prison, this chap who produced this, awful graph. Mann, the research science student who did the graph, he brought a libel action, which he lost disgracefully, and he was ordered to pay without prejudice costs until that's a indemnity cost. The whole thing was thrown out. And the IPCC just has to do this to justify its dogma. And it can't be by the science. The science is very, very clear. CO2 in increasing quantities and densities will not materially affect global warming. And you can find that in all the literature. The latest book by Stephen Koonin, Professor Koonin, asserts that. Professor Easterbrook asserts that. Professor Plimmer has been asserting it since he published in 2009. This is not me making it up. This is there. That is the science. And you see, the thing is about science, you can only entertain a theory. That's all it can be. You can hold it until it's disproved. It's called falsification. Professor Popper talked about this, and Professor Richard Feynman, a genius of a physician, American physicist, he spoke beautifully about this at the Institute in Caltech in 1974 when he talked about the scientific method. It's something you hold in mind. It's not gospel. It's not conviction. It must be doubted, otherwise it's not science.
Absolutely, and I guess almost on that note, I'd like to ask about the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, which you do also discuss a lot in the graph, and I think you've done.
Oh yes.
So in your book, you refer specifically to the 2001 and the recent September report by the IPCC, and more specifically, bringing up evidence from other sources. In particular, I think you've just raised Professor Spencer from the University of Alabama, as other sources on how you see it as being selectively picking information to create those particular hockey stick temperature charts.
It's a fundamental question, Mr. Lim, absolutely fundamental. See, the IPC, to make their dogma stick, they have to show that temperature and CO2 density and temperature rise coexist, they run together, and that CO2 precedes one and not the other. All the oxygen isotope records and all the other records of historical temperature show that CO2 follows a temperature rise, and the reason is that the oceans hold 56% of all the CO2 that's available on the planet, and there's some in the crust, but what's available? So when the temperature rises, CO2 is released by the oceans because they lose their solubility. And when the oceans get cold, they absorb CO2. And that's why when you see in the ice core records from geological ages, you'll see that when the temperature rises, the CO2 is released. And there's quite a long lag behind it. And this is what challenges fatally the dogma of the IPCC, because they see CO2 as the cause of climate change. But how can it be? CO2 doesn't come out of the Father Christmas's stocking. It has to come from somewhere. It comes from the oceans. And how does it come from the oceans? Well, the laws of physics say the only way the oceans can release it is with increasing heat. It's that's physics. It's not gospel. It's not waving your hand saying how green you are. It's not claiming ultimate authority. It's not claiming moral superiority. It's physics. And so that's how it stands with physics. Now, the problem the IPC have got is how do they get over that? The only way they can get over that is to fabricate the graphs. Because if you showed the true graphs, you'd find that temperature is highly erratic. If I may just dwell a little bit on that, if I've got time.
Absolutely.
Over the last 2,000 years, there have been some major variations in climate. I mean, 3,000 years ago was the Minoan warming, when it was very warm, 3,500. But from 250 BC to 450 AD, there was a Roman warming period when temperatures were at least 2 degrees higher than today. And there's been recent work done in the Sicilian Channel on plankton to show that, oxygen isotopes establishing that. Then we have a period of cold, which is the Dark Ages. But then from about 950 AD to 1350 AD, we have what's known as the medieval warm period. Wasn't quite as warm as the Roman period. It was about 1 degree, perhaps 1.5 degrees average, higher than today. That was followed by the Little Ice Age from 1350 to 1850, 500 years. It's true that there were warm patches in between, but solar activity during that period was very, very low. And you can see in all the diagrams, it hardly exists, no sunspot activity. And there were 3 very, very cold periods during that time. You know the pictures, they're roasting oxes on the Thames and, you know, everybody skating on the Thames. And it wasn't much fun, you know, because they didn't have central heating. Now that temperature is terribly erratic. Then we get to the 20th century, same thing. 1850 begins to start warming. We leave the Little Ice Age. By 1910, temperatures going up. And by 1934, it's very hot, the hottest year in America for the whole of that century. Not here, because we had a higher period in 1998. Then it falls away in about 1940, and from 1945 to 1969, 70, it's cold, very cold. 1947 and 1963 in this country were colder than any winters since 1740. A sharp decline. That is the temperature record over the last 2,000 years. But CO2 is continuous between 230 and 250, 280, right the way through to 1850. Then it goes up gradually and then steeply. That's accepted. But it has no correlation whatever with temperature. Now, to get over that, the IPCC have to level the temperature. Otherwise, the whole show is over. Do you see that?
Yes.
Now, I've explained what happened in the 2001 graph, but they've done it again in the 2021 graphs. And you can find those at page 7 of the summary for policymakers. And they make some extraordinary, and to my mind, really disgraceful remarks. One of the remarks they make is that in the last interglacial, that's about 125,000 years ago, was the next most recent candidate for a period of higher temperature. I'm reading from their graph. But 105,000 of those years were in the last ice age. Of course, there was no higher temperature in that ice age. And so all you've got left is the last 11,000 years. But there was very, very significant warming periods in that 10,000, 11,000 years, including the Holocene warming period. It was 5 degrees warmer. And yet the IPCC say it was warmer today than in the Holocene period. And they produce a graph to show that and say that. It's just false. You know, the Roman warming period, the medieval warming period, and the Little Ice Age are just excluded. That's from the graph A. But graph B deals with the last 130 years, and then they've simply excluded the 20s and 30s, and they've excluded the cold period of the 40s to 70s. I'd just like to quote, I wrote this down, I was so shocked by it. In September 2009, one of the climate global warming fanatics called Michael Wigley, I think it was called, yes, was writing to Professor Jones, head of the climate research unit at the meteorological office at Hadley, Essex. And they were discussing how they could get rid of these anomalies of temperature because they were wholly inconsistent with the need to show a gradual rise of temperature. And Wigley says, it would be good if we could get rid of the 1940s land blip, comparing it to the ocean temperature. Well, they did, and they have. They've done it. In the 2021 report, it's false and it's fraudulent.
And I guess on that, you obviously raised, I think, what, page 7 of the summary for policymakers.
Yes, I'm sorry, that's in my report, yes, in my book, yeah.
So firstly, would you say that from what you know, what you're familiar with, do you think that the summary for policymakers truly is the sort of main point of reference for many policymakers, politicians, and world leaders, and government advisors, etc., that will be making these important decisions in COP26?
That's a very good point. You're absolutely right, Mr. Lim. And they made a science of this, the IPCC. They released their full report, which is deliberately 3,000 to 4,000 to 5,000 pages long. And they send the summary. And it's been pointed out by a number of authors, including Christopher Booker, that the actual summary often has no connection with the text of the main report. It's astonishing. So it's a kind of, we'll throw this dust at them, and then we'll tell them, you don't have to look at this, here's what we're really saying. So they send this summary. It's intended to govern the so-called debate and discussions at these climate conferences called Conference of the Parties. That's quite deliberate. And the other thing that's quite deliberate, it's released just before the conference. Now, the reason for that is because the graphs have no basis whatsoever, a tenable basis in science. And they want to get their message across as what's the word, as dramatically as possible, seize the public headline before there can be a measured response. Well, unfortunately, there's a statistician in California called Stephen McIntyre who rumbled them in the time available. And he's done marvelous work showing that their proxy data are just utterly fallacious. So that's what they do. And you're right, that is exactly what it's intended to do. They've always done it, but this is the worst example because they know we're on a point of spending £3 trillion in this country, according to the National Grid, on decarbonisation. And that's what makes it shocking. And that's why I say it's fraudulent.
Okay, and I mean, I guess, do you think that governments haven't done a good job, particularly the UK government, in terms of seeking independent and alternative and balanced advice on their climate policy, and in particular in terms of world temperatures? Because what you've said here is, okay, they've, it's very one-sided. You clearly don't like the process, and you've seen that there is alternative data out there. And why don't you think governments are picking it up and
well, I think that the IPCC have written very cleverly the environmentalist way. There's a kind of sense of virtue about it all, and it's been built up very gradually. You see, it has been called, what's it called? Somebody called it the watermelon. Yes, green outside, red inside. There is a very strong global government element to this dogma, because the chap who founded it all, Maurice Strong, was very, very keen on global government. He was a very extreme form of socialist. And nothing wrong with that, but it is when you try to force your ideas against the balance of science. And I think that's what it was. The Labour government in 1997, from 1997, they, I think, fell into the trap of wanting to appear virtuous about this. I mean, their Climate Change Act followed the 2007 report, and it really was astonishing. There were only 2 MPs, weren't there? Peter Lilly was one of them, and I think Douglas Creswell, another one. Well, the only ones to vote against it. Now, why is that? It's a kind of groupthink, isn't it? That everyone falls into if it's virtuous and if it comes from a remote authority. The secret about the IPCC is that it's a United Nations body created by a United Nations senior official, Maurice Strong. He created the IPCC. And it's remote and it's unaccountable. And nobody knows who to point the finger at. It's a kind of remote, authoritarian, prestigious entity. And, when people declare from the pulpit that this is the truth, it's very hard to deny that if it's offered in apocalyptic terms, because you're not talking about science anymore. You're not talking about reason. It's the voice of unreason, the voice of fear, the voice of guilt, the voice of shame, all in one. It's very hard to pin, but it can't be dealt with by reason, not directly. It's very hard to know what to do, but you have to start. have to start with reason. It's got a terrible hold, but the people won't stand for it. My view is the British people, I don't think they rate this high at all. If you look at my figure 1, it's the lowest of people's priorities. You know, they're far bigger priorities. And for any statesman, poverty in the third world must be the highest priority.
Absolutely.
And how the third world is going to manage without cheap energy, I cannot see. That seems to be one of the wicked things about this.
100%, and we're actually getting onto that. So in looking at some of the bigger issues, I think you cited just now the British people's priorities. So if we, on discussing, say, what's going on in the UK and the potential outcomes of the COP26 negotiations, what impacts could you see a more radical COP26 policy having on the cost of living? And doesn't this sort of present a moral conundrum for the government? After all, the state exists to provide services, exists to promote prosperity, it exists to, as it were, deliver for the people.
Yes, I couldn't agree with you more. I mean, I completely agree with the democratic entities such as the British, Great Britain, the United Kingdom, and we're still that, requires that the interests of the people be served by its government. Now, the one thing that people need, especially a civilized economic entity such as the United Kingdom, is constant, reliable, and affordable energy. It's not something you can play with for out of virtue. When the British people realize that the basis of their industry and the warmth of their homes and the means of transport are now at risk, not only in terms of the cost when it comes to that, but actually in terms of the supply, the availability of energy to do those things, I just think the worm will turn. And we're already seeing requests, and I think quite rightly, Alistair Heath in the Telegraph wrote the other day that there ought to be a referendum. And he's quite right. The National Grid have estimated the cost of this exercise of decarbonisation at 3 trillion, that's 300,000 million. Now, I also made a note of, if I may look at it, of what Bloomberg had to say about this. Bloomberg New Energy Finance in July, the end of July, reported that the cost of net zero globally by 2050 are between 92 and 173 trillion dollars. And you know, you can't even begin to approach those figures. So unless there's an overwhelming case for putting the welfare of the people of England and Wales and Scotland and Northern Ireland at risk in this way, they should pull back and they should rely on fossil fuels and move slowly by generation to an entirely new energy base altogether, which should be done and should be started. But cheap energy must be maintained for us, and it must be maintained for the developing world. The only way to do that, short term, until we make that transfer, is with fossil fuels.
Absolutely. And I guess moving on, especially to something that you mentioned, that you also mentioned earlier, is the impact that this may have on world standards of living. You spoke about just now about the importance of delivering cheap, clean, of delivering cheap energy to the large majority of the world that still doesn't have it. What implications do you think this will have? And don't you think it's a little bit destructive for a global organization that seeks to deliver what they themselves like to call a representative global outcome? Don't you think it's a little bit hypocritical?
I think it's a very good point. See, it's kind of Morton's fork they've got. At one side, the whole idea of the IPCC and of Strong and his Earth Summit was to benefit the developing world with massive cash transfers. And if you go back to the opening of the 2015 conference, Paris, one of the things they resolved to do was to pay each contributory country was to pay 100 billion a year there was to be a minimum of 100 billion a year to be paid out to developing countries from a thing called the Climate Green Fund or something. So that was always part of it, the idea to give to the developing countries. But the snag is, to have a policy which of decarbonization. You can't be it selective. You know, virginity is something that is indivisible, so is sovereignty. And you can't have one nation emitting 1% being decarbonized totally and expect to get away with it, with its electorate. The action has to be global, and therefore what's being proposed by the IPCC is that the developing countries should share the business of decarbonization, because otherwise there's no point having the policy at all. So they're in a cleft stick. Do you follow?
Yes.
And they're caught. And of course, the just thing is to allow them to continue, because it's not going to have any effect. And even if it did have an effect, and I don't acknowledge at all that it will, even if temperature did increase by 2 degrees, so what? It's been hotter than that in the last 11,000 years. And we must make steps to deal with it. But to deny, it's a scandal of humanity that there should be such levels of poverty. As I get to the stage when I'm more or less looking backwards at everything, I think it's the worst thing of all is to contemplate the waste of humanity in poverty, particularly in Africa and parts of South America, and only certain parts of the Far East, where all that is needed is available law, enforceable law, the internet for information, so that people can be liberated from ignorance, and cheap energy. And then hopefully the whole of the human race will rise together in prosperity and in welfare and in amity. And that's what I feel deeply about, and it's what Lord Lawson felt strongly about when he formed his Global Warming Policy Foundation.
Absolutely. And I think this going on to if you would, what we would like to see what you'd like to see as a sort of alternative solution. What do you think should be, instead of a lot of what you might describe as responding to this IPCC report, what do you think should be the main priority for COP?
I think that's a terribly good question. I mean, I thought about this ever since I got involved. And the first thing is we must, of course, get off fossil fuels. I mean, that goes without asking, because it's like burning your floorboards. I mean, the fossil fuels were created in the Carboniferous era and over millions and millions of years. And, you know, we're burning them up. You know, I don't know how long it would take to burn them up, but it wouldn't take more than a few hundred years, as far as I understand. But you're using the indirect light of the sun, work of the sun, and photosynthesis for your energy policy. Well, what we must be doing, surely, and I'll mention a larger issue shortly, is to move over to the nuclear element of energy. I don't just mean nuclear energy. I mean, of course, I mean the nucleus of the atom, but I also mean the electron in the atom, so that we could use the combination of those two elements of nuclear phenomena to create energy, which is more or less unlimited. And so if you can create through electrolysis hydrogen and oxygen from water, then you have a portable form of energy. I don't think it makes sense to create hydrogen from hydrocarbons, because that's simply going back to where you started. But the technology is growing for electrolysis, nuclear-powered electrolysis, and I see that as a most wonderful thing, because a number of three main ones. It removes us from the geopolitical problem of who supplies our energy.
Yes,
you know, we
very
don't
pertinent today.
Yeah, yes, and of course Russia and Saudi Arabia, I mean, they have different regimes to us, different reasons, and so on. But we must get out of that. We shouldn't dig out of the ground like primitive Bronze Age people what we need to keep our houses warm and run our cars. The second thing is that it's pollutant free, and the only waste product is a bit of water and oxygen, if you can call that a waste product. And the final thing, it's more or less unlimited.
Yes.
Now, because we have to face, humanity has to face I don't want to overstate it, but humanity has to face within 5 to 100 years, possibly 1,000 years, we will enter the next ice age because they only last 11 to 14,000 years, and they're created by the eccentric circuit of the Earth around the sun. So that's what I feel, but it's very exciting. I mean, it'll only take a generation to do this. And if you're going to spend a fraction of 3 trillion, that's what you'll be spending it on.
Yes, and I think it's good to emphasize the need for sort of some level of a transition from governments to a sustainable energy source. And
Yes.
I think even if you look at the current supply chain crisis or the lorry drivers crisis, that supply crisis, you look at issues such as gas shortages and the so-called gas shortage, and you say actually a lot of the British energy base is based on unreliable, or quite a bit of it is based on unreliable solar and wind energy. Which, you know, I think if you watch some of the Bruce Group's interviews with Peter Lilly, Lord Lilly in the past, I think about a month ago, he himself said actually these are pretty unreliable. So a long-term sustainable source of energy, I think is the best way to go. And it's good to reiterate that none of us are being anti-sustainability. None of us are advocating on behalf of any coal company.
There's no shortage of energy in the universe, and we just have to tap the unlimited source. I mean, there will be nuclear waste, but thorium is nearly so bad as uranium. And you know, human beings are nothing if not ingenious. And if you release the brain power of the whole world, including Africa, including South America, we've already released it in the Far East. You know, it's nothing we can accomplish if we do it in amity, goodwill, and loving each other as if that we were each other. It's a simple test of goodwill between human beings.
Absolutely, and I think originally that was meant to be the purpose of the United Nations. It very much has been, and maybe in the case of COP26, hopefully those outcomes do change, and people do actually see there is a need for some sort of game plan, even if they want to take it to themselves to believe that there is some sort of climate emergency. They still need a game plan. And a lot of the solutions that people have come up with in the past, from people having to change their lifestyles, people not using plastic straws.
Well, that's it goes without saying. Everyone wants to do that. That's what makes me so angry. It's the way that the IPCC and those behind it, you know, people like what's his name, Monbiot, and other extreme evangelists of environmentalism, that they overlook. They're riding the goodwill of the people. Everybody wants to look after the planet. Nobody actually wants to damage the planet. You know, I feel appalled every time I throw a plastic bottle away, you know, and I'm sure everyone does. And it's wonderful that we've made that progress, you know, and that we're so careful about pesticides and herbicides. And, you know, I'm not saying everybody should stop fishing, but I'm very, very fond of fishing. But I sort of feel, you know, you have to come to terms with others who are living on this planet, including the fish.
Absolutely. And I think I'm in agreement with a lot of people that may be watching, in saying that there is a need for an actual game plan, a long-term sustainable source of energy, and maybe
what hope it would give, wouldn't it, to people?
Absolutely.
They realized it was not polluting. If it lasted forever, it was not dependent on others. I mean, what a wonderful thing. As we enter, inevitably, we're going to be very cold. Not us, but sooner or later.
And of course, telling people at least on a personal level, to change their entire lifestyles is neither quite literally unsustainable and ineffective.
So arrogant. That's just so arrogant. Who are we to tell other people in the rest of the world?
Absolutely.
That they should roll back on the limited things they have? I mean, no, it's outrageous. Absolutely. No.
And I think hopefully the COP outcomes do become different. Hopefully that there's some practical level of policy discussion on a global, on the global stage.
Yes, I can't resist to say they might. And one hopefully the governments will actually COP out. It'd be wonderful if they did. Because they can't go further with this. It has to stop now.
100%, absolutely. And well, thank you
Well,
very much.
thank you very much for having me on your program. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Jeremy Nieboer, for speaking to
Right.
us. Now, for all those interested, you can, I think the book's coming out soon. I think you'll be able to purchase it on Amazon. The book,
Yeah, I could, yes.
yes, the book Climate, All Is Well, All Will Be Well. Thank you very much, and thank you very much to everyone for watching.
Thank you.
Thank you.